heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 320, covering the week of August 8th through August 12th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. YouTube page is invaluable. You've got not only the podcasts there that we record and then put up there, but you also have a lot of our lectures from our conferences, our Abbeville U videos. The most recent is the Jefferson Hemmings myth, which has received a fair amount of attention on there, of course, by the title. We're getting a lot of people who view the video and don't like it, which is hilarious, but those kind of videos are on the YouTube page. If you're watching on YouTube, click on that little super thanks button under the videos and throw a few pennies our way. Those donations do help keep those videos alive and, of course, help our mission to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. If you go to abbevilleinstitute.org, that's abbeville.institute.org, you can find all of our social media pages. Click on those. You can also give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition. And, of course, you get our daily dose of Dixie, Monday through Friday or Monday through Saturday, or Monday, in that time period, right? Usually it's 5 days a week, so please don't unsubscribe. It's our way we keep in contact with you. You can get our daily dose. You can, of course, get information about upcoming webinars, our Zoom webinars. We will have one, I believe, in October on Robert E. Lee. It's going to be a multiple day or at least a longer day webinar, so you're going to want to get involved in that. We will also have another one again at the end of the month of August. We're just trying to finalize what we're going to do with that. So look for those webinars. And of course, you also get information about forthcoming conferences and other information that we do. So that is a great resource for us. You can also click on that support tab while you're at abbevilleinstitute.org, or just click on that box that says donate, right? I mean, that's how you support us. We do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like everything we do, consider that tax-deductible donation. You can donate annually, monthly, or a one-time gift. All those things are available. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Let people know you love it. Share our articles on social media. We're not on Facebook, but you can share our information around. That's a great way to help promote the Institute. We do appreciate all you do and for sharing our information around the internet. All right. Well, let's talk about the articles we had this week. Got all the good stuff this week. It's a lot of fun. I want to start with we had a couple of personal reflections this week on Monday and Thursday. Both great pieces. And we did have the second part of Ryan Walter's piece on Lord Lyons, which is, of course, interesting. Somebody emailed me, by the way, saying that they didn't get part one. Check those spam folders on your email. Make sure you whitelist the email address that the information comes from, because sometimes these things can go into your spam folder. Your email server might block it. So people don't always get the emails. We send them out all the time, but make sure you're getting those emails. And of course, we did send out part one last week. And then we had a great piece by Clyde Wilson this week on Reconstruction. So a lot of good stuff, and then also a piece on foreign policy. I actually, in the theme that I want to talk about, we'll kind of start with that piece on Reconstruction, then work backwards. One of the things that we talk about all the time on this podcast and on the website is the distortion of American history. And what I mean by that is the reluctance of the establishment to say things that go against the fashionable trends. And of course, the fashionable trend now is that Reconstruction was a tragedy, not because of what it did to the South, but because it was unfinished. This is Eric Foner's The Unfinished Revolution. This is the idea that Reconstruction didn't go far enough. They didn't hang enough Southerners. They didn't confiscate enough property. They didn't punish the South fearfully enough. That too little was done. That the North abandoned Reconstruction too quickly. That they could have done more for the free black population in the South. And that white Southerners, of course, were terrorizing everybody, and that's why they stopped the process. Northerners got tired of it because of racism and other things. These are the kind of things that you get out of the establishment narrative on Reconstruction. If only the good radicals had stayed in charge and power a little while longer, if just poor old Thad Stevens had not kicked the bucket in the 1860s, then Reconstruction would have been a much more glorious event, and we would have had a real communist revolution in America. Essentially, that's what they're looking for. That, of course, is a narrative built in, say, the last half century. And really, I mean, again, Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction solidified that narrative. And nowadays, Straussians, West Coast Straussians, neoconservatives, all these people, leftists, latch on to this view of Reconstruction, and this has become the dominant view. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're on the right, quote unquote, or on the left. This is how you portray Reconstruction. Of course, we know that for a very long time, that the other view was actually ascendant, that Reconstruction was a tragedy not because of what it didn't accomplish, but because of what it did accomplish, which was punishing the South, forcing an entire population of people into poverty. And the political, social, and economic consequences were just tragic in the South. You know, people were impoverished, people lost their property, people were being abused by an out-of-control government. And this piece by Clyde Wilson on Friday gets into what happened to the free black population of the South in this period of Reconstruction. And he uses, which I find very interesting, at the end of the piece, he uses two books by African-American authors to buttress his claim. You see, there wasn't a monolithic view of Reconstruction from black Americans that it was this glorious period and that all these great do-good Republicans showed up in the South and it was just these evil white Democrats that caused all kinds of problems. There are black Americans who said the exact opposite. We've published the Hiram Rhodes Rebels letter to U.S. Grant in 1875 on the website that details his opposition to Reconstruction. And he says, look, what we've decided, what we've come to realize in the waning years of Reconstruction is that black Americans have just been a pawn, that there's no altruism in these Reconstruction governments. There's no altruism in these Republicans who come down here and try to set up governments. All they're trying to do is just empower themselves and get rich. They're not really out for the former slaves. And so this is a view of Reconstruction that you don't often hear about, that black Americans in the South, many of them got tired of it. They were tired of the Republican Party and what the Republican Party was doing. Now, a lot of these black Americans would stay Republicans until the 1960s in America because they thought that that was still the best way forward to press their political and social and economic rights. But as Clyde points out, there are a lot of thriving black communities in the South up until about the mid-20th century. And it wasn't just black Americans who were impoverished during Reconstruction. It was white Americans who suffered too. I mean, this is the thing that you often miss about this. And he links at the end of the article a couple of great new books on Reconstruction, Punished with Poverty by the Kennedy twins, and Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee. Both of these books give you a much more comprehensive view of Reconstruction. People would say the older view of Reconstruction, but I don't think the Kennedy book is really older. He just points out all of the things that happened economically in the South that were punishing this part of America. So, I mean, this is a really important thing to get. And of course, we also have these two books that he mentions, the John Wallace book, Carpetbag Rule in Florida. And of course, we link to these. This John Wallace was born a slave. He was a Union soldier, and he was in Florida after the end of the war. And he became disillusioned with Reconstruction because he thought that there were people in the Republican Party who were not out for good. I mean, they were out for their own pockets. And he talks about, as Clyde says in the piece, he said there were three factions of carpetbaggers. The smallest, to which he belonged, formed around a governor who was something of a fanatic for reform, but not corrupt, and had a real concern for the freedmen. The other two were competing groups of crooks who were interested only in the looting prospects of public office. They never did anything for the freedmen except mobilize them to hate Southern whites. He has good things to say about the Southern conservatives. They wanted to preserve their interests, of course, and to restore law and order. But they had no hostility to the freedmen, and in political maneuvering always kept their word. I mean, this is the thing. So here you have John Wallace, a black American, saying nice things about white Southern conservatives and picking on the carpetbaggers who moved to Florida. And he said this. I mean, he basically, if you read the introduction of the book, he says, look, the thing is, black Americans could have been elevated by aligning more with the Southern conservatives than with the carpetbaggers, because the carpetbaggers are only out for their own good, not out for us. They were out for their own good. And so this is an interesting book. I mean, again, a former Union soldier, a man who had served in the Union in the Northern colored troops, U.S. colored troops. And so the other book that he mentions, of course, is The American Negro from William Hannibal Thomas, who was also born, he was born free in Ohio, but he lost an arm in the war and served in the U.S. colored troops. And he was more in line with, say, Booker T. Washington, saying, well, look, part of the problem with black American society is themselves. They're not, this is, that we need to elevate ourselves and not rely on white Americans or the Republican Party or the radical Republicans, whatever it is, to do this for us. So these are unpopular opinions. You say these things now, and people would say, "Oh no, I mean you can't say these. You can't say this stuff. This does not go along with the mainstream narrative about what happened." But these are things that were said by black Americans themselves in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I find this piece fascinating, and I think you'll enjoy it. Now, so this is kind of the distortion of history that we talk about. You don't get this. The other thing you don't get is this view of Colonel House, right, in the South in World War I, which Jack Marcourt wrote a piece on Wednesday about, that war that House built. If you don't know about Colonel House, he was one of Woodrow Wilson's most trusted advisors. Edwin M. House is his name. But he was certainly an imperialist. House wrote a little book entitled Philip Drew Administrator, and he talked about how the United States needed to have a military dictator, and they needed to go to war in Europe, and this would solidify strong centralized power. And not many people know much about House. Now, House, of course, was from the South. He was born in Texas, and he certainly had. I mean, he was never really a colonel. He was just called Colonel House. And so, House is part of this southern side of expansionism, and there was certainly that there. On the other side of this, you had Claude Kitchin, who was from North Carolina, and Claude Kitchin made a great speech against entry into World War I. And we talked about Claude Kitchin in a lecture. I had a great lecture on this at one of our scholars conferences several years ago on the South and foreign policy. There was a comparison between Wilson the Southerner and Kitchin the Southerner in this lecture. And it's fantastic. We actually reproduce it on the website in a text form. We had it transcribed. So go out there and look for that too. But this is a nice example of the diversity in the South, and how the South, even though it's often seen as a place of expansionism, was an area that certainly was interested in also in the other side of that. In fact, Kitchin, to great political expense, opposed the war. He was one of the lone voices against American entry into World War I. But this is where you have this really interesting side of the South, and a part of Southern history that's often just overlooked. And it's overlooked because it doesn't fit a narrative. It doesn't fit a description of the South or description of the United States, for example, that's in line with the mainstream narrative. The United States gets involved in World War I, it's over there, we got all this rah-rah, and the only people that opposed the war, of course, were socialists and others who were anarchists who were interested in disrupting the United States. Well, you had a lot of Southerners who would have supported Kitchin, who were against the war for I think you could say, valid reasons. They saw it as a distortion of the American tradition, as American foreign policy. They looked at it as a very bad move for the United States. And this is a view that's often not presented in your mainstream history courses, right? We just don't get that as much. I like this piece. I think that Jack did a good job here. House is one of those individuals that Glenn Beck, for example, talked a lot about House for years. I was talking about House for years before that. If you don't know much about House, this is a nice introduction to who he was. And also, if you don't really know much about Claude Kitchin, this is also a very good piece, an introduction to Claude Kitchin as well. So you've got to read this. But again, this is this other view of America that you don't often get. We try to provide that alternative view. And then the last in that particular vein is this piece by Ryan Walters, Lord Lyons and the Sectional Conflict. Lord Lyons, of course, was the British ambassador to the United States during the war. He wrote some really interesting things about the war. One of the things he wrote is that, of course, his sympathies would be with the North, he said, because he was against slavery. But he wasn't so certain he could trust the North. In fact, at one point, Ryan quotes him in a letter saying, we need to protect Canada because we're not so certain that these Northerners aren't going to invade Canada. They're a little bit aggressive. And he didn't think that this was something that they should overlook, that the North was being aggressive. And then he had this really interesting quote. He says, I hope we may see some moderation of tone of the newspapers. The people of the North are beginning to be aware of the immense encouragement which their prediction of a war with England have given to the Southern foe. I understand that the effect at Richmond of the repeated assertions in the Northern papers of the hostility of England to the North has been prodigious. I have written so much officially on the risk of a sudden declaration of war against England by the United States that I have nothing to add on this subject. That such an act of madness is so far from impossible that we ought to be prepared for it at any moment, I am thoroughly convinced. And so here he is saying, I think that there could be war against war against England from the United States, not from the South, but from the United States. And of course, Lyons was involved in the infamous Trent affair. He was a very good diplomat and good at soothing the tensions. But he really thought that there could have been a war with the United States and Britain. He wasn't so certain that the British were more in line with the South. I mean, he did see cotton as an important part of the trade. He wasn't so certain that it would be in best interest for England to side with the South. But he didn't really trust the United States. He didn't trust the North. And I think that's an important takeaway from this, that there was a lot of suspicion about the motivation for the North in Great Britain and around the world. And that was, of course, something that Lyons would often talk about. And he was really concerned about Northern actions, particularly in the early years of the war, right? I mean, 1861, with what Lincoln did in Maryland, he thought that was a dangerous situation. He thought that the Northern government, he had a quote here, Ryan Walters quotes it, he said that Seward was a particular worry for him, and he believed, quote, takes a personal pleasure in spying and arresting. Right? Spying and arresting. This is what William H. Seward took a great personal pleasure in doing. We know Edwin Stanton later on was even worse. Right? So again, this is the side of the war that you don't often see. The side of the war in the North. That's why we have our Northern Studies articles here and there. And this is kind of that, right? It's a Northern Studies article in a way, but that gives you an alternate version of what's going on in America, a more complex and deeper version of what's going on in America in the 1850s and 60s and 70s. It's one thing we always try to do here at the Institute, provide that alternative view of things to give you a little more flavor on American history. And then for the last couple of pieces, I like both these personal recollection pieces. One is entitled Aunt Elizabeth, the Desert Fox, and General Jackson. And this is by Joyce Bennett from Maryland. She writes great stuff. And I like this piece because it's about an older relative, Aunt Elizabeth. And Aunt Elizabeth had a view of America, had a view of her section, I should say, that did not evolve. And what I mean by that is she failed to recognize the vast changes taking place around Washington, D.C. She still saw Washington, D.C. as a place that was just a sleepy little southern town. And when a lot of people moved there in the 60s, that's what it was. I know I had family that lived around there in the 60s. And that's all it was. We've had Casey Chalk talk about this quite a bit. It was just a sleepy little southern town. There wasn't a whole lot going on living around Northern Virginia, and I mean, people from the outside were still called Yankees and other things. I mean, this happened. And by the 1980s into the 90s, it had been so radically transformed. You could say this was even starting in the 60s, right? But really, when the expansion of FDR in the 1940s, World War II into the 50s, and of course the construction of the Pentagon and everything else, you started seeing all these people move into D.C. and surrounding areas, right? That's when it really started to explode, the surrounding areas. In fact, my father was a firefighter in that area, Fairfax County. He was a retired assistant chief there. And what the fire department started doing around there was burning down a lot of these old plantation homes for training. I mean, this started happening. The old Virginia was literally being burned to the ground to clear out areas so that they could actually put houses and other things. Sad. But this was going on. And you had all these people moving in, but you still had this very old South there. And that's Aunt Elizabeth. And Joyce Bennett talks about how that old part of Maryland and Virginia is essentially dying out, but still being alive in certain people, those that had an attachment to them. But the thing about Elizabeth is she really didn't think about it. It was just unconscious. It was something that she just did. It was part of her DNA. And unfortunately, all that's going away. And I was listening to a podcast the other day. Again, I think I talked about this last week, where there was an individual from South Carolina, a young man. You wouldn't have known it. This young man sounded like somebody from, I don't know, the Midwest, Indiana somewhere. But he's from South Carolina, and he's just spewing, regurgitating all of the mainstream things that everybody says about the South and about the lost cause and all these. He's just regurgitating this stuff because that's what he's told. He's been told that his entire life through his education system, and then of course in the university. And he doesn't. He's a person from nowhere. He's not from anywhere. And we were doing our webinar on William Gilmore Simms. Something Dr. Rogers said in that seminar I think was important. And this is why regionalism is so important. You don't have America without regions. America isn't a monolithic, uniform thing. It's regions. And you can't have good literature. You can't have good art without regionalism. And so as that disappears, as we lose a South, and I'll say this, as we lose a deep North, I mean, some of that's going away too, though I think the cultural imperialism certainly is there and how people think about it. Northerners are, it's more acceptable to hang on to a Northern, like a Massachusetts identity or a New England identity or a New York identity than it is for a Southern identity, because the South is just evil of everything. And that all goes back to Reconstruction, by the way, and the war in what 1850s and what Northerners were saying about the South. The South was always the nasty other. But you have this regionalism disappearing, and without that regionalism, you don't have real art in America. Again, it can be literature, it can be visual arts, it can be music. You lose that. You lose it. There was a video I saw the other day of Bob Dylan, of course, the folk singer from New York that never really had his own stuff. He was just inauthentic in a lot of ways. But he talked about how the Clancy brothers in Ireland were such an influence for him. But again, this is a culture that hung on to itself in the face of imperialism from the British. But he talks about that Irish folk music and how important it was for his growth as an artist. And Liam Clancy was just a fantastic singer. Liam Clancy was so good, and so was Tommy Makem, who would perform with the Clancy brothers. Just fantastic. If you like folk music and you've never listened to the Clancy brothers, or Tommy Makem and the Clancy brothers, or Makem and Clancy, eventually it was just Liam Clancy and Tommy Makem, you're missing out. I mean, there's a lot of groups. There's the Dubliners, for example, which are good, but the Clancy brothers are the best of the best when it comes to Irish folk music, and they were very popular in the 1960s and the 70s and 80s. All of them are now dead, and both Tommy Makem and Liam Clancy continued to perform for years, and then of course they both became ill and died of I think they were both smokers. Makem was a smoker, I believe, had lung cancer. I think Liam Clancy, same thing. But they were just fantastic musicians, and that kind of, it can't come from anywhere but from that culture in Ireland. And this is what you had in the South. You can't get Southern culture unless it's authentic and it comes from a place. And this is why we do literature. It's why we do Brandon Meeks and we do these things because we want to kind of show that something that comes from the bottom up, it bubbles up from something. That's why we talk about music. These are things that are important for this continuity between the old and the new South. This kind of cultural continuity that you have to have from that place. It can't come from anything else. And people recognize this, whether they're from the South or not. And the last thing I want to talk about is When Things Go South by Julie Payne. She's from the Dakotas, began listening to this podcast and reading the website, and really got involved and interested in Southern literature and history. She was someone who was introduced to this through Tom Woods, who was a friend of the Institute, and then through yours truly and my work with Tom Woods. But she grew up with the Lincoln myth, and she said, I met a man who was critical of that, and it started opening my eyes a little bit, and then I got into other things, and then I started reading. I started reading Southern literature. I started reading the side of Southern politics, and I didn't know about this stuff. It was just something that was alien to me. I didn't know anything about this, and I started reading it. My eyes were open, and I love how she talks about the South and her journey through what happened to her. She says, "Uncovering real Southern history and literature has become like a recurring dream I sometimes have of wandering through what I believe is my home. As I walk through it, more and more rooms appear where I never noticed them before, and I am astonished by the spaciousness and beauty of this home." And so they went to the South. They went to Florida, and they saw some interesting, Southern jewels. And then she said this. She said, "The South is definitely a place, but that's not all it is. The South is a living being. It breathes and has a soul. It cannot be encapsulated in a book or paragraph, but it becomes more tangible through every encounter with its residents, writers, and statesmen. Being an American and denied its company is like being a child deprived of the nurture of one of its parents. My reunion with it has filled an emptiness, given depth to my personal life, and increased my appreciation for our complete American story. At last I have been handed the missing pieces of a puzzle that finally allow the whole picture to come into view. There lingers some resentment for those who sever me from this gift of wisdom, humor, courage, and experience offered by the South, this amputated part of the body of American heritage. But the resentment is superseded by the gratitude for individuals and institutions keeping the Southern tradition alive, and the joy of embracing all that is good in that tradition. I will always be grateful things went south for me, and am hopeful that if the truth can reach me way out west, it can reach others. I am sure I will never pass for a Southerner, but I have discovered that in many ways I am one, and my heart is certainly at home there." This is a great final summary. In fact, Clyde Wilson doesn't often comment on the articles on the website, but he did on this one. And that was really good. That was a nice conclusion. And I think something that, I'm honored to be listed in this, humbled that this little podcast and the things we do at the Institute and my other work outside of this, the Brian McClanahan Show and other things, have influenced people like this. It's it's an important part of what we do to reach more people. And I like how she talks about it's an amputated part of the American story. If you don't understand the South, if you just listen to Charles Sumner in the 1850s and excoriating South Carolina as being this other, if you listen to Victor Davis Hanson and the Straussians, who basically segregate the South off and say it's not really American, you're missing a major part of the American story, and you're just getting half it. It's like you're losing a parent. I've said the South is America, and it was recognized as the dominant part of America for much of early American history. It dominated America long after that. Even into the early 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, politically, the South dominated America, and there was this very rich part of Southern culture that was still there. It's only been in the last half century that there's been an attempt to purge all of this by both the left and the quote-unquote right. And that's the sad part. That's the tragedy, the real tragedy. We started with the tragedy. That's the real tragedy of modern America. So it's an honor to do this every week and to do these, to have these articles there and to produce this for you. And we do hope you enjoy it and that you contribute to the Institute, because that's how all this stuff works. We do need your support financially to keep all these things going. All right. Until next time, good day.